the Russians getting involved in a war between the United States and Iran, getting directly involved simply because they are deeply involved in the Ukraine war. And this is a matter of first things first. You know, they want to take care of Ukraine. But I think there's no question that the Russians would help the Iranians, and over time they would probably help them more and more, and that would mean that the United States and Russia would be at each other's throat in Iran as well as in Ukraine, and this would not be a good situation. Of course, I may be wrong here, and the Russians may simply come to the aid of Ukraine. It is possible. Right. I don't think it's likely, but I do think it's possible. I think we're playing with fire here. The fact is that the United States is filled with people who believe that we can use the big stick to solve every problem and to beat back every adversary. And the Israelis, by the way, have the same mentality. And I don't understand why we don't recognize that there are just limits to what you can do with military force. And the idea that you can bash Iran, you can bash Russia, you can bleed Russia white in Ukraine, all of these ideas have led to nothing but failure. Continuing to go down this road makes no sense to me.
John Mearsheimer's analysis highlights a recurring theme in U.S. foreign policy: the belief that military force is the ultimate solution to geopolitical challenges. He begins by addressing the potential for Russia's involvement in a U.S.-Iran conflict. While Russia's current focus is on Ukraine, he doesn't dismiss the possibility that, over time, Russia could increase its support for Iran. This would put the United States and Russia in direct confrontation, not only in Ukraine but also in the Middle East, a scenario that would have catastrophic consequences. Mearsheimer is careful to emphasize that Russia's priority is first things first. For now, their primary focus remains on Ukraine. However, if the United States were to escalate tensions with Iran, Russia might feel compelled to intervene. This support may start as limited aid but could expand, creating a situation where the U.S. and Russia find themselves locked in a proxy war on two fronts. Mearsheimer warns that this is playing with fire. The idea of stretching U.S. military resources across multiple theaters is not only strategically reckless but also historically disastrous. The root of the problem, according to Mearsheimer, lies in a mindset deeply entrenched in Washington: the belief that wielding the big stick can solve all problems. This philosophy, shared by many U.S. policymakers and echoed by Israeli leadership, is based on the assumption that military might equal strategic success. However, Mearsheimer points out that this approach has repeatedly failed. From Iraq to Afghanistan, and now in Ukraine, the outcomes have been prolonged conflict, high costs, and little to no strategic gain. Mearsheimer's frustration is evident. He questions why the U.S. continues down this path, ignoring the lessons of past failures. The notion that Russia can be bled white in Ukraine, or that Iran can be subdued through sheer force, is not only misguided but dangerous. Both Russia and Iran are resilient adversaries with their own strategies and alliances. Treating them as mere obstacles to be overcome by brute force ignores the complexities of modern geopolitics. A key point Mearsheimer raises is the importance of understanding limits. Every great power in history has faced constraints, and recognizing those limits is crucial for maintaining stability. Yet, in Washington and Tel Aviv, there seems to be a collective denial of this reality. The belief that military intervention can reshape the world order disregards the complex dynamics at play. Countries like Russia and Iran are not passive players. They have agency, strategies, and the capability to resist. The failures Mearsheimer highlights are not isolated incidents. They are part of a broader pattern of overreach. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and now the potential for escalation with Iran all stem from the same flawed thinking. Mearsheimer is calling for a fundamental reassessment of U.S. foreign policy. He argues that diplomacy, restraint, and a clear understanding of national interests should guide decision-making, not the illusion of invincibility. Another significant aspect of Mearsheimer's critique is his understanding of human nature and decision-making. He recognizes that many in power genuinely believe in the efficacy of military force. This is not just rhetoric. It's a deeply held conviction. Changing the minds of those who hold this belief is incredibly challenging. As a result, The problem is not just strategic, but also ideological. It's about shifting a mindset that views military power as the primary tool of statecraft. Mearsheimer's warnings are particularly relevant in the context of a multipolar world. The unipolar moment, if it ever truly existed, is over. Rising powers like China and regional actors like Iran are asserting their influence. The U.S. can no longer assume that it can act unilaterally without facing significant consequences. Clinging to outdated notions of dominance will only lead to more conflict and decline. A critical question Mearsheimer raises is whether the U.S. can adapt to this new reality. Can Washington embrace a more pragmatic approach that acknowledges the limits of power? Can it prioritize diplomacy over military intervention? The answers to these questions will determine the future of U.S. foreign policy and its role in the world. In addition to the strategic implications, Mearsheimer also touches on the human cost of these conflicts. The idea of bleeding Russia white in Ukraine is not just a strategic blunder, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. Prolonging the conflict means more lives lost, more destruction, and more suffering. Mearsheimer's critique is not just about strategy. It's about recognizing the moral dimensions of foreign policy decisions. The same applies to Iran. A military confrontation with Iran would have devastating consequences, not only for the region but for the world. The human cost of such a conflict would be immense. Mearsheimer is urging policymakers to consider these consequences before rushing into another war. Ultimately, Mearsheimer's message is one of caution and realism. He is not advocating for isolationism, but for a more measured approach to foreign policy, one that recognizes the limits of military power and prioritizes diplomacy and strategic restraint. It's a call for a fundamental shift in how the U.S. engages with the world. In conclusion, Mearsheimer's analysis is a stark reminder of the dangers of overreach. The belief that military force can solve all problems is not only flawed but dangerous. The U.S. must recognize its limits and adopt a more pragmatic approach to foreign policy. The stakes are too high for anything less. The path forward requires humility, a willingness to learn from past mistakes, and a commitment to diplomacy and restraint. It's a difficult road, but it's the only one that offers a chance for lasting peace and stability. According to John Mearsheimer, the Russians getting directly involved in a war between the United States and Iran is unlikely because they are already deeply entangled in the Ukraine conflict. For them, it's a matter of prioritizing. First things first, and Ukraine comes first. However, there's no doubt that Russia would support Iran, and over time, that support would likely increase. This could eventually place the United States and Russia in direct opposition, not only in Ukraine but also in Iran, creating a dangerous and volatile situation. Of course, I could be wrong. It's possible the Russians may intervene more directly, but I don't think it's likely. Still, we're playing with fire here. The reality is that many in the United States believe we can use brute force to solve every problem and defeat every adversary. The Israelis, by the way, share this mentality. What I don't understand is why we fail to recognize the limits of military power. The belief that you can crush Iran, bleed Russia dry in Ukraine, or force outcomes through sheer force has only resulted in failure. Continuing down this path, in my view, makes no sense. Thanks for watching.